Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. It was a hot June day in 2012. 28-year-old William Martin LaFever was in the Escalante region of southern Utah, a land of rocky plateaus and deep canyons. William, who was on the autism spectrum, was a quiet young man who avoided eye contact and spoke little, but had a deep inner connection to nature. Although he struggled to communicate with the outside world, he trusted his sense of direction. And with a simple plan in his mind, he set out on his journey. His father had promised to send him money in Page, Arizona, but William had no way to reach the bank or any shipping points. Communication issues with his family led him to come up with a solution on his own. Rejecting the idea of taking a bus or hitchhiking, he decided to walk. He would walk to Page. On paper, the route was about 64 kilometers, but in the barren, rugged and water-scarce terrain of Escalante, this distance was just a number. He packed a few bottles of water, some snacks, and a light backpack. He had neither an extensive map nor a GPS device. He planned to follow the riverbeds, hoping to navigate the terrain. While this route might have been a challenge for a hiker, for William, it was both a physical and mental test. He trusted nature, as it made more sense to him than the complex social rules of the outside world. As he took his first steps, the roads were dusty. In the early morning, the air was still cool, but there was something William didn't know. The path ahead would test him not only with heat but with loneliness as well. The vast canyons of Escalante stood before him, like silent walls that deepened his isolation. The first few days of William LaFever's journey went by without physical exhaustion. He was careful with his steps, trying to navigate the route by following the Escalante River. He trusted the coolness of the river and planned to progress as long as he could access water. However, this area of southeastern Utah wasn't as simple as it seemed on the map. The river would occasionally disappear between rocks or dry up entirely. He had only a few bottles of water and some simple food, perhaps a few granola bars, and some nuts. These limited resources could only last a hiker a few days at best. William rationed his food, choosing to rest in the shade during the hottest hours and walking during cooler times. But the midday heat was merciless. The earth was painted in shades of yellow and orange, and the sand clung to his shoes with every step. The temperature reached up to 40°C during the day, while at night, it dropped dramatically below 10°C. William curled up to warm himself, unable to find anything extra to cover himself with. Silence was everywhere. No bird songs, no wind. Occasionally, he would hear the faint chirp of a cicada or the distant rumbling of a rock tumbling. This solitude was both a refuge and a challenge for William. Due to his autism, he was used to staying away from social crowds, but being in such a deeply isolated environment began to strain his nervous system. Without a map or compass, he tried to determine his direction by the river's slope. He used the sunrise and sunset to guide himself, navigating with the natural structure of the valleys. But the area was so complex that he often found himself encountering similar rocks and paths, forcing him to walk in circles. By the end of the first few days, William still hadn't come close to Page. Instead, he had moved farther away from civilization, sinking deeper into the wild nature. Gradually, his water bottles ran dry. Unable to find a drinkable source, he sometimes tried to fill small containers with water that had surfaced in muddy pools. Without the option to purify the water, he had no choice but to drink it as is. Physical exhaustion hadn't fully set in yet, but his body was beginning to signal trouble. His lips were dry, his head was spinning, and his energy was rapidly fading. The journey had now turned into a struggle against the unknown. By the 5th day of his walk, returning was no longer a real option for William LaFever. At the start of his journey, he still had the option of turning back, but now it was far too late. The streams, steep rocky passages, and dense underbrush he had passed made it nearly impossible for him to retrace his steps. Additionally, his physical strength was diminishing with each passing day. Spending hours under the sun had begun to leave deep marks on his body. His pale skin couldn't withstand the desert sun without protection. His shoulders, arms and neck were sunburned, with some areas of his skin beginning to blister. His clothes were already inadequate. They weren't thick enough to protect him from either the heat or the cold. During the day, he was battling the desert heat, and at night, the cold. To better manage his energy, he changed his strategy. During the day, he only sought shelter in the shade for a few hours, saving his main walking for the night. However, the desert nights were pitch dark, and when the moonlight wasn't enough, even taking a step became risky. His feet began to swell. Walking on the dusty, rocky trails made each step more painful. He continued following the riverbed, but most parts of this water source had dried up by now. Occasionally, he found small puddles of water that seeped through cracks in the rocks or collected in muddy depressions. There was almost no sign of life in these murky waters, but once in a while, small frogs caught his attention. By this point, he was close to the limits of hunger and unconsciousness. He began catching the frogs and eating them raw, trying to provide his body with protein and fluids. He no longer cared about the taste of the meat or whether it was clean. His survival instincts had taken over. His stomach was constantly empty, and because his body couldn't find energy, it was rapidly depleting his muscles. His tongue was dry, his lips cracked, and his eyes were sunken. His mind was foggy. His sense of time was slowly erasing. Was it morning? Was it evening? Was the path he was walking on straight or a dead end? He couldn't tell anymore. It wasn't his will that was pushing his body forward now, but his survival instinct. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on, but he knew that if he stopped, he would die. This thought kept pushing him forward, even if his steps were fewer and slower. William Lefevre had now been in the desert for days, turning into weeks. As he entered the third week, his body was severely damaged from water and salt deprivation, as well as muscle loss. His arms and legs had visibly thinned, and his bones were starting to show under his skin. He had trouble standing, and when his head spun, he would hold on to the ground with his hands to avoid falling. But despite this exhaustion, he still hadn't succumbed to that fundamental urge, the survival instinct. Walking had become an action performed by reflex rather than will. Some days, William could only take a few steps, covering no more than 100 meters. Returning, sitting, or giving up never entered his mind. Even though his mental state was foggy, moving forward was still the only concept that made sense to him. Along the way, he encountered decaying animal carcasses. These sights would typically cause disgust or fear, but for William they were, now, a matter of survival. He picked small, unspoiled pieces from parts he deemed acceptable and consumed them. Such eating carried significant risks, but at that point, he had no luxury of choice. No matter how weak his body became, his digestive system still tried to function. However, not long after, stomach cramps and nausea set in. Some nights, he would curl up in severe abdominal pain, unable to move until morning. Any time he managed. To find water was critical. Most of the time it was stagnant and muddy. He had no equipment to boil or filter the water. Yet drinking it was his only option. This carried risks of parasites and bacteria, but not drinking was equivalent to death. Sometimes after drinking, he experienced headaches, nausea, or even hallucinations. Yet, he continued to drink directly, because survival had now become not only a physical but a mental battle. During this time, a strange bond had developed between him and nature. He tried to determine direction by observing the flight paths of birds, the scent of the earth, or the temperature of the rocks. Some days, he would rest for a few minutes in the shade of a tree, trying to gather vital energy. As the color of the sky changed, he knew time had passed, but he couldn't count the days. There were no calendars, no clocks, only the question of whether he could continue breathing. And every morning, as long as he managed to open his eyes, he decided to take a few more steps. Crawling along the dry, cracked bed of the Escalante River, William Lefevre had surpassed the limits of human endurance. He had long since stopped walking. His legs could no longer carry him, and when he tried to stand, his knees would immediately buckle and he would collapse. As he crawled under the sun, the tips of his fingers and his knees were worn down by the soil, and his skin was peeling in places. He had no sense of direction left, nor any goal. Yet, he still hadn't stopped moving. During this time, his family, having not heard from William for days, grew concerned and filed a missing person report with Utah authorities. William's autism only intensified the family's anxiety because it made it incredibly difficult for him to find his way or ask for help under such harsh natural conditions. After the missing person report, the Garfield County Sheriff's Department was called into action. When ground searches in the desert conditions yielded no results, search and rescue teams began air patrols with helicopter support. The Escalante area was vast, rugged, and difficult to access. Despite the vastness of the region, one of the pilots noticed an unusual figure at ground level. A silhouette, close to the color of sand, was lying motionless in the riverbed. When the helicopter descended, it became clear that the person on the ground was still alive. William's eyes were open, but he was struggling to respond. His body had become so weak that he could only move his eyes, unable to speak or even lift his arms. Due to severe dehydration and prolonged malnutrition, his body mass index had fallen below critical levels. His skin was clinging to his bones, and his facial features had nearly collapsed. The rescue team immediately intervened. Water was given to William, but he was encouraged to drink slowly as providing too much fluid suddenly could pose serious risks in his condition. Before being lifted into the helicopter, his body temperature was checked, as there was a risk of hypothermia due to extreme fluid and energy loss. A health officer from the sheriff's department reported that William was still conscious, but lacked the energy to speak. At that moment, it was not the end of 3 weeks of survival in the desert, but a miraculous beginning. William's survival was a success, born not only of resilience but also the strength of human will, the concern of his family, and the careful observations of the search teams. When William Lefevre was airlifted to Garfield County Hospital after spending 21 days in the Escalante Desert, his body was on the brink of collapse. Doctors discovered that his body mass index was below the fatal threshold. He had lost about 15 kilograms, and his muscle mass had almost entirely wasted away. His skin was dry, his lips cracked, and his sunburns had deepened. However, even more surprising was the fact that despite all these conditions, his vital organs were still functioning. Initial interventions at the hospital allowed him to start receiving fluids and nutrition in a controlled manner. Over time, William's consciousness became clearer, but his physical recovery took weeks. During his time in intensive care, his ability to speak gradually returned. Even when he wasn't speaking, he communicated through eye contact and simple head movements. His family referred to his rescue as a miracle. William's brother, in a statement to the press, said, "William is not a talkative person, but he is strong. This silence does not make him weak, it makes him resilient." His journey was not just a story of loss for his family, but also proof of the remarkable resilience of human nature. The medical world also scrutinized William's survival under a scientific lens. Experts noted that autistic individuals could adapt extraordinarily well to certain environments. Their adherence to routines allowed them to develop patience and repetitive strategies in emergencies. William's instinctive behaviors, such as following the river without a clear sense of direction, walking at night, and resting during the day, demonstrated that he was applying the correct strategies, whether consciously or semi-consciously. The Ive press described the event as an example of silent heroism. William never made dramatic statements or described his experiences in detail, but his survival inspired countless people. Search and rescue strategies for individuals lost in nature were re-evaluated, with an emphasis on more sensitive planning for neurodivergent individuals. When William Lefevre returned to his life, he continued to live with the same quiet demeanor. His journey in the desert became one of the most silent survival stories in history, but its impact was profound.